I still remember the taste of the air the day we set foot on the island. Sharp, metallic, like the sea had teeth. The boatman hadn't spoken much during the crossing. His hands were knotted like driftwood, gripping the wheel. His eyes fixed straight ahead, as though looking back might cost him something. When Harris tried small talk, "You been running folks out here long?" the man only shook his head once and muttered, "Not if I can help it." That was our welcome. The island itself rose like a broken knuckle out of the water. Sheer cliffs gnawed raw by waves, gulls wheeling in the grey sky, and at its crown, half lost in the mist, the lighthouse stood. Tall, skeletal, leaning just enough to make my stomach tighten when I looked at it. The lantern glass was shattered, its iron frame corroded by decades of salt. But still it loomed, a sentinel long past its purpose. We climbed the slick stone steps from the dock, our boots slipping on algae and salt. Harris led, carrying himself with the unshakable authority of a man who had been in worse places and survived them. Martha came next, muttering curses as she hauled her tool bag. Dale was behind her, nervous energy in every step, his eyes darting from the sea to the cliffs, as though expecting them to lunge at him. Reyes trailed, his rosary clinking faintly against his chest, and I came last, notebook pressed under my arm, trying to absorb the details and catalog the place as I always did. The society's instructions had been clear: restore the structure enough to keep it standing, document any historical artifacts, and prepare a report for future funding. Straightforward, I thought, until I laid eyes on the base of the lighthouse. The foundation stones were warped, as though the earth itself had shifted. Cracks veined through them, wide enough to slide a hand into, and rusted bolts jutted out at odd angles. At one side of the lighthouse, half buried by a recent landslide, an iron door bulged from the rock like a tumor. "Christ," Martha muttered, wiping her brow with her sleeve. "That's not standard construction." "A storm shelter?" Dale offered weakly. Harris crouched, brushing away loose gravel with his glove. The door was thick, riveted, its surface blackened by salt and time. Bolts the size of my wrist sealed it shut, though corrosion had eaten deep into the metal. And at the center, faint beneath centuries of rust, was a sigil, a circle lined with jagged teeth, or waves, or maybe both. Harris gave a low whistle. "Whatever it is, it's not on the blueprints." "Leave it sealed," Reyes said at once. His voice was sharp, his knuckles wide around the cross at his chest. "Some things are buried for a reason." Martha smirked, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Or maybe it's just a forgotten pantry, and you will find pickled fish inside. Don't be so dramatic." But as I stood there, notebook trembling in my hands, I couldn't shake the sense that this door wasn't keeping something out. It was keeping something in. We spent the afternoon hauling supplies inside, setting up in what had once been the keeper's quarters. The air was stale, heavy with mildew. Cobwebs draped the corners like funeral veils, and each creak of the rotting stairs sent dust spiraling through the dim light. While Harris checked the structural integrity and Martha cursed at the generator, I walked the rooms, scribbling. The walls were carved with marks, some graffiti left by passing sailors, some older, etched deep into the stone. Names, dates, prayers, and one inscription scrawled in frantic, uneven lines stopped me cold. The sea will take us back. I didn't show the others. By the time the sun dropped, the fog was already curling thick around the lighthouse. From the lantern room, I could barely see the rocks below, though I could hear the crash of waves. Distant, muffled. Something else too. A low moan that rolled through the mist. At first I thought it was the wind, until I noticed the rhythm. Long, mournful, and mechanical. A foghorn. But the lighthouse was gutted. No machinery, no horn, just broken gears and rust. Yet this sound kept coming, rising and falling like a heartbeat. Reyes crossed himself, whispering prayers in Spanish. Marta muttered that it was just an echo from the mainland, though her voice lacked conviction. And Dale said nothing at all. Harris broke the silence. Tomorrow we'll secure the lantern room. But tonight, his eyes flickered toward the base of the lighthouse. The door. We will see what's under there. Could be structural, could be valuable. Either way, it's our job. Reyes protested. Harris didn't bend though, and none of us really wanted to go. But in the end, we followed. That was what you did when someone like Harris gave orders. You followed, even into the dark. It took Marta half an hour to work the bolts loose, sparks flying as her tool screeched against corroded iron. The air thickened with the smell of rust and wet earth. But at last, the final lock gave way, with a groan that echoed like a scream. The door shifted, heavy as stone, and a breath of air rolled out from the gap. Cold, briny, stinking of rot. I gagged, covering my nose. Dale staggered back, his face pale, and Reyes muttered another prayer. Harris only set his jaw, muscles straining as he hauled the door wide. The stairwell yawned open before us, spiraling down into complete blackness. Our lanterns barely touched the first steps, before the dark swallowed them whole. The air rising from below was damp and heavy, whispering against the stone like the sea sliding over sand. Harris hefted his pack, clipped the lamp to his chest. "We will take a quick look, just to see how far it goes." Reyes shook his head violently. "No, not tonight, not ever." But the decision was made. Harris led, Martha followed, her jaw tight. Dale lingered, eyes wide, before forcing himself to step forward. Reyes hesitated for a while, his rosary clenched. Then he gave a shuddering breath and went in after them. I was last again. I set my notebook trembling against my chest, tightening the strap of my lamp, and placed one foot on the first step. The stone was slick, almost slimy. My breath echoed back to me, warped by the curve of the stairwell. Each step carried me deeper into a silence that felt more alive than the storm outside. The heavy door groaned shut behind us, sealing the last silver of daylight away. And we descended into the dark. The steps seemed endless. We moved in single file, lantern beams cutting swaths through the dark, catching glimpses of slick stone and rivulets of seawater, tracing veins down the walls. The stairwell curved tight, spiraling deeper into the earth. My boots slipped more than once, the moss underfoot soft and yielding like wet cloth. No one spoke for a long while. Our breaths and the scrape of metal on stone were the only sounds. But as the dark pressed heavier, Dale's voice cracked the silence. "How far do you think this goes?" "Until we find the bottom," Harris grunted. Reyes muttered something sharp in Spanish under his breath. His rosary beads clicked faintly as he gripped them. I wanted to write, to capture every detail. The strange slickness of the stone, the way the air thickened the deeper we went, as if water pressed against the walls. But my hands were shaking too hard. So I kept the notebook clutched against me like armor instead. At last, the stairwell widened into a landing. Our lights spilled out into a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in shadow. The floor was uneven, broken by pools of black water that reflected our lamps in jagged fragments. The smell here was worse. Salt and rust mingled with something sour, something old. Martha swore under her breath. "This isn't just a basement." "No," Harris said. His voice was low, almost reverent. "It's a vault." Our beams swept the room, and one by one, we froze. Rows of iron boxes stood in neat formation, lining the walls and stretching into the dark. Coffins, each riveted shut, their surfaces mottled with rust. Some were intact, bolts straining with corrosion. Others gaped open, lids cast aside, edges sharp and jagged. And inside those, bodies lay slumped, their clothing eaten by salt, but still clinging to their forms. Not skeletons, not fossils, bodies. Their skin was pale, bloated in places, cracked in others. Patches of barnacles crusted their arms, their faces. Hair floated around their skulls, as though they were still underwater. And their eyes, God, their eyes, clouded, milky, yet too whole. Not empty sockets, but orbs that seemed to glisten faintly in the lamplight. Dale gagged. Jesus Christ. Reyes clutched his cross tighter. I told you this was wrong. Shipwreck victims, Harris said quickly, though I could hear the strain in his voice. Stored here, maybe for burial, maybe to study the tide's effect. There will be an explanation. An explanation? Martha snapped. Her light swept over a coffin split open. Its occupant curled unnaturally, jaw unhinged wide in a soundless scream. You call this an explanation? I forced my shaking hand to open my notebook. My pen scratched against damp paper. Bodies preserved, not skeletonized. Saltwater intrusion? Ritual storage? But even as I wrote, the words felt hollow. This wasn't preservation. This was imprisonment. In the center of the chamber, half submerged in a pool, we found something else. A chest of green brass, its edges furred with corrosion, but intact. Harris waded through ankle-deep water to wrench it open. And inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather-bound book. He handed it to me. Your specialty. I peeled the cloth away with trembling fingers. The book was swollen with damp, its pages warped, but the ink clung stubbornly. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, uneven. I read aloud. The sea takes all. To keep them from rising, we bind them here until the call is silenced. Pray the fog holds. Pray the horn does not sound. If it does, we are undone. The foghorn moaned above us. The sound rolled through the stone, deep and mournful, vibrating in my chest. Dust sifted from the ceiling, rippling the pools at our feet. The bodies in the coffins seemed to shudder with it, as though the blast passed through them. No, Reyes whispered. No, no, no. I snapped my light to the far side of the chamber. Something had moved, just a flicker, but enough to notice it. Dale saw it too, his lamp jerked toward the same place. "Did you?" Before he could finish, a sound cut him off. A knock, soft, muffled, from inside one of the sealed coffins. The 5 of us froze. My throat tightened until I couldn't breathe. Another knock followed, louder. Then a third, slow and deliberate. "That's it," Reyes hissed, his voice cracked with panic. "We are leaving, right now." Harris raised his lamp, his eyes locked on the rattling coffin. There could be survivors, trapped. "Survivors?" Martha's voice climbed, brittle with fear. "From when? The last time this place was used must have been over 100 years ago." The knocking turned into a scrape, nails or claws dragging against iron from the inside. My skin crawled. The air felt thicker, harder to pull into my lungs. And then the coffin tipped. It crashed to the floor, lid splitting loose with a scream of metal. Water spilled from within, slick and black, soaking into the mossy stone. And in the beam of Harris's lantern, the body inside sat up with a convulsive gasp, seawater pouring from its mouth. Its eyes rolled wide, clouded yet seeing. Its chest heaved once, twice, forcing out more water. Then its head snapped toward us, jaw opening wide, teeth clacking together in a wet, broken rhythm. My notebook slipped from my hands, splashing into the pool at my feet. Around us, in the silence that followed, came another sound. The scrape of dozens of coffins shifting, bolts groaning, hinges straining. And the foghorn moaned again, louder, shaking the vault like a heartbeat. The scraping grew louder. Iron lids groaned, bolts wrenched free with a scream of metal. Water spilled across the stone floor, black and briny, rising fast around our boots. The first figure shuddered on its feet, ribs heaving, hair slick against its skull. Then another coffin split open, then another. One by one, they rose. Dozens of them. Men in tattered uniforms, their flesh pale and swollen. Barnacles dotting their arms, seaweed trailing from their jaws. Their eyes glistened with a blind, milky sheen. Yet, every single one turned toward us, as though they could see in perfect clarity. The sound came next, a chorus of clicks, wet and sharp, echoing against the stone. Some clacked their jaws, others scraped nails against the coffin rims. The noise layered, a rhythm older than language. "Run," Reyes whispered, his voice cracked, barely a breath. Run! The drowned moved. They didn't stumble like corpses. They lunged, fast, water sloshing from their mouths, claws raking the air. Harris swung his lantern hard, the beam blinding for a heartbeat, and shoved Martha toward the stairs. "Move!" he roared. Dale hesitated, frozen. One of the figures reached him first, a sailor with half its jaw gone, teeth exposed, clicking. It seized Dale's arm, yanked him into the rising water. His scream echoed, high and raw, cut short when another set of hands dragged him under. His lantern spun in the dark, beam failing, then went out completely. Martha screamed. She wrenched a crowbar from her pack and swung wildly at the nearest drowned. The iron connected with a crack that split bone and sprayed brine, but the thing only staggered, then reformed, water bubbling from its wound. "They don't stop," she shrieked. "They don't fucking stop." Reyes was already gone, scrambling up the stairs two at a time, his prayers tumbling out between gasps. Martha bolted after him, crowbar dripping, her light bouncing madly off the walls. "Go!" Harris shoved me forward. "I will cover you." He didn't finish. One of the drowned leapt from the pool, slamming into him. Harris swung his pick, burying it deep into the thing's chest. For a moment, it clung to him, jaw snapping inches from his face. Then two more surged up from the water, dragging him down in a thrashing heap. His roar cut off, swallowed by the flood. I ran. The stairwell stretched above, slick with moss, each step trembling with the tremor of the foghorn. My lungs burned, my notebook thumping against my chest, and behind me, the clicks rose in a frenzy, closer, faster, as though the drowned were climbing the walls themselves. The air grew heavier, wet, salt searing my throat. My lamp flickered, and I stumbled, caught myself on the stone, and kept climbing. A scream echoed above me. Reyes, then another voice, Martha's, shrill and breaking. I forced my legs to move faster, but when I rounded the curve, I saw it. Martha was halfway up the stairs, blood slicking her face, her crowbar swinging weakly. Reyes was just above her, hand outstretched, but something pale had him by the legs. He screamed as he was yanked down, his body slamming into Martha's. She shrieked as claws tore into her shoulder, dragging her back. Their lamps tumbled, beams scattering, before vanishing into the dark below. The clicks swelled, triumphant. I ran past the place where they had been, eyes fixed only on the thin glow of the door above. My lungs clawed for air. My hands scraped raw on the stone as I hauled myself upward. The foghorn blared again, so close it rattled my skull. Dust rained from the ceiling, and the whole stairwell shook, groaning like it would collapse. I reached the top, my hand slammed against the iron door. It was nearly closed, the counterweight shifting. I shoved with everything I had, muscles screaming, until it groaned open enough for me to slip through. I fell forward in the lighthouse basement, gasping, soaked, covered in salt. Behind me, the stairwell echoed with the clicks, climbing closer. I staggered up the rotting wooden stairs, every step a battle, my legs trembling. The foghorn moaned again, not mechanical but alive, a voice drawn from the sea itself. The walls of the lighthouse pulsed with it, the whole tower shivering. I burst into the lantern room, the storm outside raging. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the sea. Waves crashing high against the cliffs, the fog curling thick as smoke. For a moment, I thought I was safe. I collapsed against the railing, chest heaving, journal pressed to me like a relic. Then I saw them. Shapes in the water. Dozens, maybe hundreds. Pale heads breaking the surface. Shoulders rising with the waves. Their clicks carried across the sea. Faint but growing, blending with the thunder. The vault hadn't held them. It had only bound them until the call returned. And the call had come. The lantern room shuddered under my feet. Below, I heard the crash of the iron door as it gave way. The drowned were climbing. I could hear them on the stairs now, claws raking, water slapping against the walls. I pressed my back to the shattered lantern frame, lightning blazing around me. The foghorn wailed one last time, long and mournful, shaking my bones. I knew then I would not leave this place, but maybe, just maybe, someone would find the journal. The last thing I wrote before the light flickered out was this: the sea takes all, and now it comes for us. I came to Harriston at the start of the winter, not because I wanted to, but because the company sent me. They needed a surveyor to chart the ridges, draft maps for the thaw when prospectors and developers would come sniffling around for ore. I was the youngest hand in office, and youngest always meant disposable. Fresh air will do you good, they had said. It's not much work, just keep your head down and draw what you see. The train carried me north for 2 days. At first, the landscape looked like anywhere else. Towns thinning, barns scattered, pale fields flecked with frost. But by the second morning, the land had emptied. pine forests closed in, the snow piled higher and higher, smothering everything in white. Sometimes the ridges loomed so close, I thought the train would scrape them. And other times, the world dropped away entirely, valleys yawning black beyond the drifts. The only sign of life was the smoke. Long before we reached Harriston, I saw faint threads of it seeping upward through the trees, stitched into a single grey quilt that hung heavy across the sky. The town itself seemed carved out of the snow, a single main street lined with squat brick buildings, houses shouldering close together for warmth, all crowned with roofs sagging under the weight of white. The station itself was little more than a shack with a rusted sign, and when I stepped onto the platform, the cold hit me like a blow, sharp enough to make my eyes water. I had the strange feeling that I had stepped off not just a train, but out of the world I knew. The boarding house stood on the square, a broad-shouldered thing with smoke trailing from 2 chimneys. Mrs. Fletcher, its keeper, was waiting as though she had known I was coming, though I hadn't sent word. She was a tall woman, with a voice like gravel and eyes that looked through me instead of at me. She asked no questions though, just handed me a brass key and showed me upstairs to a narrow room. It was simple: iron bed, wooden desk, a stove tucked into the corner. But after 2 days of train benches, it felt like luxury. The stove radiated heat, its iron sides ticking softly. I fed logs until my boots began to steam, and when I finally sat, I thought maybe the assignment wouldn't be so bad after all. That first night, I ate in the common hall. The stew was thick enough to hold a spoon upright, and the bread hard enough to chip a tooth. The others kept their eyes on their bowls, speaking little beyond what was necessary. Not unkind, just closed. Men with blackened hands from the mines, women with flour-dusted aprons, and children who stared until their mothers tucked them down. Whenever I tried to strike a conversation, I got polite nods, tight smiles, and words clipped short. I told myself it was because I was new. Outsiders always had to earn their places in small towns. The days that followed slipped into routine. I rose before dawn, packed my satchel, and set out into the ridges. The landscape was stark, almost too large for the eye to settle on. Jagged black pines that creaked in the wind, valleys where the snow lay unbroken, except for the tracks of elk or wolves. Cliffs iced so heavily they glittered in the pale sun like crystal. I traced lines across it with my compass and ledger, sketching peaks and crests, marking frozen streams. From those heights, Harriston looked like a smudge of smoke at the bottom of a valley. Always smoke. No matter the hour, the town bledded in soft ribbons. And not just from chimneys. The snow outside every home was dusted with flecks of ash, as though it had seeped out of the walls themselves. Evenings I spent by the stove in my room, copying numbers into neat lines, or in the tavern, listening. The men spoke slow, their words weighed down, never wasted. The women who served them moved quickly, eyes fixed anywhere but the door. It wasn't silence that hung over Harriston exactly. It was something closer to discipline, a way of living that felt old, practiced, and rigid. Then there were the oddities I couldn't ignore. Every family I passed seemed to have some vessel for ash. Not just one, but several. Wooden boxes, clay jars, tin buckets, all filled and sealed, stacked neat against walls or under porches. Even children carried little tins when they played in the snow, leaving black smears where they dropped them. It was everywhere, inescapable. I asked once, half joking, why they didn't simply dump it. The grocer paused, his hands tightening on the scale, and gave me a smile so thin it might have been painted on. "Waste not," he said. That was all. By the end of the first week, I noticed the rhythm of the town more clearly. Mornings carried a kind of ease. Voices lingered longer in shops. Children shrieked louder on the ice. But as dusk fell, a hush grew. Windows shuttered earlier. Conversations shortened. And the square emptied until only the lamps hissed against the cold. And always the smoke thickened, spilling from every chimney until Harriston seemed to blur into its own haze. The people burned as though their lives depended on it. I told myself it was just a way of mountain towns in deep winter, close-held, quiet, strange in their customs. And yet I felt it, even then, that subtle weight when the sun slid behind the ridges. The way the air itself seemed to grow tense. It made the hair along my arms prickle, though I couldn't have said why. Looking back, that was the first time I realized Harriston wasn't like anywhere else. I should have known it sooner. But it wasn't until the second week, when I began to hear the name spoken in whispers, that I understood there was something here that no map could chart. It all began with a slip of the tongue. I was at the tavern late one evening, snow piled knee-high against the door, the fire roaring so hot it made the air swim. Most of the men had already left, leaving only 3 or 4 at the tables. Their mugs half drained, their voices softened to murmurs. I had finished my maps early that day, and lingered with my drink longer than usual, half listening without meaning to. One of the older miners, a man with a beard white as the snow outside, leaned forward to his companion and muttered, "Not long now till he comes round again." The other man shifted, eyes flicking to me before lowering his mug. He didn't answer. I might have let it pass, but the way they grew quiet after, the way their shoulders stiffened, made the words cling in my head. He? Who was he? I thought about asking, but the weight in the room told me not to. So I finished my drink and left it alone, at least for a while. The rhythm of the town grew stranger in the second week. The mornings were still lively enough, but by late afternoon, an anxiousness settled in the streets. Shutters drew closed, footsteps hurried, and even Miss Fletcher, usually so brisk, would stand at the window of the boarding house as the light failed, her lips moving faintly as if in prayer. I started noticing how often people glanced at the chimneys, not at the smoke itself, but at the neat little stacks of boxes and jars waiting on porches. Their lids clamped tight, their sides blackened with use. Children were sent out to check them, scurrying through the snow with red cheeks and serious faces. Sometimes I would see whole families gathered by the hearth, not for warmth, but for the task of carefully scraping out the ashes, sifting them fine, storing them away as though preparing grain for winter. It unsettled me, though I couldn't have said why. The answer came in part from Mrs. Fletcher. I caught her in the kitchen one night, after most of the boarders had gone up to their rooms. She was stirring a pot of broth, her broad back to me, when I asked, as casually as I could, "What do you keep all the ashes for?" The spoon stilled. She didn't turn, didn't answer right away. For a moment, the only sound was the simmer of the pot. Then she said, in a voice so low I had to lean closer to hear, "For him." I opened my mouth to ask more, but she set the spoon down hard and turned, her eyes sharp in the lamplight. "That's all you need to know," she said. "Best not to ask questions that don't want answering." I should have left it, but the words clung to me like burrs. For him. That night, I dreamed of the smoke again, curling endless into the sky, until it formed the outline of a face too large to fit the heavens. I woke with sweat freezing on my skin, and the following evening, I saw him. The hush fell just after dark, sudden and unnatural, like someone had drawn a curtain across the world. One moment the tavern across the square was spilling laughter into the snow. The next, it was sealed silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I stood at my window, staring out into the pale glow of lamplight. And that was when I noticed the doors. One by one, they opened, not wide, just enough for a hand to slip through. A box or a tin sat gently outside. No one stepped fully into the street. No voices carried. Only the soft creak of hinges and the whisper of offerings laid down. Then he came. He moved slow, deliberate, his long coat brushing the snow, his wide-brimmed hat heavy with frost. At his side hung a sack, gaping open like a mouth. From each door he collected, lifting the vessel with a careful hand, tipping them into the sack and returning them empty to the stoop. His movements were silent, methodical, as though he had been walking the same path for centuries. The lamplight caught him once, and I saw his face. Or rather, I didn't. The brim of his hat cast him in such shadow that no features emerged, only the suggestion of a mouth, curved faintly upward. I pressed back from the window, heart thundering, a wild thought gripping me. If he looked up, he had seen me. Not the window, not the glass, me. I stood frozen in the half-dark, watching him make his slow procession down the street, until the snow swallowed him and the silence loosened its hold. Doors closed, windows latched, and the town exhaled. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the crunch of his boots, the whisper of ash pouring into the sack. And though I tried to tell myself it was just a tradition, some old superstition I couldn't understand, I knew better. There was weight in his silence, gravity, like the whole town orbited him, and I had just glimpsed the center. The day after I saw him, Harrison looked different to me, though nothing had changed. Smoke still curled endlessly from the chimneys. The miners still tramped through the square at dawn, their faces blank with sleep. The grocer still weighed flour on his brass scale, nodding to each customer without a wasted word. Yet there was a tension I hadn't noticed before, threaded through every glance, every movement, like the whole town was holding its breath. I felt the weight of my own watching. People seemed to sense it on me, though I said nothing. The butcher served me wordlessly, eyes fixed on the meat. A boy who had once waved when I passed now ducked behind his father's legs. And Mrs. Fletcher spoke to me in clipped syllables, as if extra words might carry risk. The memory of that figure moving from door to door clung to me like soot. I couldn't shake the soundless tilt of the sack, the way the townsfolk offered their ash with the same instinct as breathing. And even more than that, the certainty that he had passed beneath my window, aware of me, even as I crouched in the shadows. On the ridges, I tried to lose myself in work, measuring, mapping, tracing lines through the snow. But the silence pressed too close. Even in the open air, I felt as if I were being studied. At one point, standing on a rise, I thought I saw a dark shape moving in the tree line below, slow and steady, leaving no trail. But when I blinked, it was gone. That same evening, as dusk bled into the valley, I found Mrs. Fletcher in the hall. She was carrying a pail of ash, her apron grey with it, her face streaked from where she had rubbed her brow with dusty hands. "You should keep to your room tonight," she said without preamble. "Why?" My voice came out too quickly, too sharp, Her eyes flicked to mine, then away again. Because he knows you now, and he doesn't pass a door twice. I tried to ask what she meant, but she brushed past me, leaving a faint trail of ash behind her on the floorboards. I spent the next hours pacing, listening, waiting. The boarding house grew quiet as the others retired early. Beyond my window, the square emptied, lamps dimmed, shutters clamped tight. It felt like the entire town had retreated into itself, folding inward in anticipation. Then the hush fell. It wasn't silence, not exactly. Silence is natural. This was suffocating, thick, absolute. Even the stove seemed to hold its crackle, and my heart thudded against it like a fist on a wall. Then came the knock. Soft, free measured taps, a rhythm older than the world itself. I froze by the hearth. The fire had burnt low, leaving a bed of embers and a thick layer of grey beneath them. My hands fumbled for the poker. Then the second knock came, louder, rattling the whole frame, sending a shiver through the glass of the window. The ash spilled onto the rug as I scraped, clumsy in my panic. I found the flower tin Mrs. Fletcher had left on the mantel days before. Empty, but serviceable. I filled it with shaking hands, half of it missing the mark, dusting the floorboards. The third knock thundered through me like a heartbeat. I staggered to the door, tin clutched to my chest. And when I opened it, the cold struck like a blade. He was there, closer than I had ever seen him, the brim of his hat casting his face into impossible shadow, the long coat brushing the snow. Frost clung to the hem, yet the flakes falling from the sky veered aside, as though unwilling to touch him. At his side hung the sack, yawning open. He lifted one hand, palm up, patient. I held out the tin, ashamed at how pitiful it looked. He took it and poured it into the sack, careful, deliberate, not a grain wasted. The ash vanished into the dark without sound. Then he turned his head toward me. The shadow beneath his head deepened. I couldn't see eyes, couldn't see anything but the faint curve of a mouth. And yet I felt it, the weight of his attention. It pressed down on me, crushing, until my knees nearly buckled. His mouth stretched wider, not in joy, not in malice. It was something older, a smile shaped only by the knowledge that he had been acknowledged. I stumbled back, breath ragged, but he only tipped his head in that slow, impossible courtesy, turned and walked on. The crunch of his boots marked his retreat. One house, then another, until at last the sound was swallowed by the snow. I shut the door and slid the bolt, chest heaving. My hands trembled so badly I dropped the tin, the clang echoing too loud in the stillness. When I turned to the hearth, the fire was gone. Not just the flame, gone entirely. The stone was bare, scrubbed clean, as though no fire had ever burned there at all. I sat in the cold for hours, unable to move. And when dawn finally came, I stumbled into the square. The townsfolk were already about, but quieter than usual, and though no one spoke to me, their glances said enough. I had been marked. A miner brushed past, muttering under his breath without meeting my eye. I caught only 2 words. First offering. After that, the others treated me differently. Not with suspicion, but with a strange, weary recognition. I was no longer merely an outsider. I had joined their orbit, pulled into the same gravity that held them all. In the days that followed, I tried to tell myself I was unchanged, that life went on as it had before. I drew my maps, I warmed my hands by the fire, and I took my meals in silence beside the other boarders. But the truth was harder to ignore with every passing night. It wasn't simply that I had seen him. It was that he had seen me. No one said as much aloud, but the way they looked at me spoke volumes. The butcher, who once ignored me with studied indifference, now gave me a stiff nod when I entered. The grocer set my measure of flour down more gently, with something like pity in his eyes. And Mrs. Fletcher left no words, only a fresh tin by my door each evening, as though I might need it again. And I did. The second night he came, the knock was softer, but more insistent. I was ready, ash scraped and waiting. His sack opened, his hand extended, and the ritual repeated. Again, that crushing gaze, that curve of impossible smile, before he turned and went on. It became routine. Each night the silence fell. Each night the knock came. And each morning I woke cold, the hearth swept bare. My fire never lasted until dawn anymore. The ashes were never enough. Yet it wasn't fear that gnawed at me. It was something darker. Curiosity. I found myself waiting by the window, listening for the sound of his boots in the snow. I traced his route in my mind, house by house, door by door, until he vanished into the edge of the forest. None of the villagers ever spoke of where he went after. None even seemed to want to know. But I needed to. And on the 7th night, I made my choice. I filled my tin as always, opened the door when the knock came, and gave him my offering. His head tilted toward me, the brim of his hat heavy with snow. I even thought for a moment he lingered longer than usual, as if waiting for me to falter. But then he tipped his head and moved on. I counted to 30 under my breath before slipping into my coat. The cold hit sharp as knives, but I hardly felt it. The square was hushed, doors bolted, lamps dark. Only the narrow trail of footprints in the snow marked his passage. And I followed, careful to keep my distance, each of my steps deliberate, my breath clouding in the moonlight. He moved slowly, as though time bent around him. At each house the same ritual. The hand extended, the sack opened, and the ash collected. No words spoken, no sound but the faint whisper of dust pouring into the endless dark. I watched from corners, from behind fences, pressing myself into shadows whenever he paused. My heart thudded like a drum, but he never turned, never broke his rhythm. The further he went, the more the town seemed to change. The houses thinned, the lamps gave way to darkness, and the silence grew heavier, unnatural, as though even the forest held its breath. I thought more than once of turning back, but the sight of him kept pulling me on. And at last, past the final cottage on the edge of Harriston, he did not stop. He carried on into the trees, his sack sagging low, his boots leaving no imprint now, though the snow was thick and unbroken. I followed anyway. The forest closed around me, black pines heavy with frost, branches sagging under the weight of ice. My own footsteps seemed deafening, though he moved soundlessly ahead. And the deeper we went, the more the world seemed to thin, until even the cold felt strange, less like weather and more like absence. Then, through the trunks, I saw it, a clearing, and at its center stood a pit of stone, wide and black, ringed with frostbitten earth. Around it lay heaps of ash, mountains of it, as though every hearth in the valley for centuries had been emptied here. The snow did not touch it, the wind avoided it. It was a hollow too perfect, too deliberate. The collector stepped to the edge and emptied his sack in a long, steady pour. The ash vanished into the pit without a sound, swallowed whole as if the darkness had no bottom. When the last grain fell, he straightened, and for the first time since I had seen him, he spoke. Not in words I knew, but in a sound like the crackle of countless fires, layered and low. The pit responded, a slow breath rising from below, carrying with it the stench of something vast and smoldering. The trees bent toward it, and the ground shivered. I fell to my knees, clutching the frozen earth, and for a heartbeat, I saw. Not with my eyes, but with something deeper, a glimpse into what lay beneath that pit. Not earth, not stone, but a shape so enormous my mind could not hold it. A body of cinders and void, coiled in silence, its chest rising once, twice, with the rhythm of a sleeping god. The ash was not an offering. It was fuel. The collector turned then, his brim tilting, as though he knew I was there. I stumbled back, heart hammering, breath tearing at my throat. His face remained shadowed, unreadable, but the weight of his attention pressed on me again, heavier than before, crushing in its certainty. He just lifted one finger, slowly and deliberately, not pointing at me, beckoning. I ran. Branches tore at my throat, snow burnt my lungs, but I didn't stop until the lights of Harriston flickered through the trees. I slammed the boarding house door behind me, chest heaving, the taste of ash in my mouth. I told myself I had imagined it, that the cold and the dark had twisted my senses. But when I crawled into bed, I found my pillow blackened, streaked with gray. And when I closed my eyes, I heard the sound of that breath, deep beneath the earth, patient and endless. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw that pit. I felt the heat that wasn't heat, the breath that wasn't air, rising from below. And always, I felt the collector's gaze on me, even when he wasn't there, that impossible weight pressing down, as if to remind me that I had been seen, that I had followed, that I had trespassed too far. The next evening, I considered leaving Harriston altogether. My maps were nearly complete, and nothing tied me here but fear. I could take the North Road, push through the passes before the snow grew worse. Perhaps, if I moved quickly enough, I could forget. But when I stepped into the square with my bag half packed, I stopped. Every door was already shut tight. Ash boxes lined the stoops, more than usual, stacked high as though every family had emptied their hearths twice over. The air was thick. Not with smoke this time, but with anticipation. The sky itself seemed lower, the clouds sagging under some invisible weight. And I understood then. It was not a night to leave. It was a night he would come in earnest. When the hush fell, it was worse than before. Not silence, but a suffocation, as though sound itself had been pulled from the world. The first knock at my door came like a heartbeat inside my skull. I had no ash to give. My hearth was empty. Still, I opened the tin, scraped it desperately against the stone, trying to gather the faintest smear of dust. By the time I carried it to the door, my hands were shaking so badly the lid rattled. But I opened it to him. The brim of his hat, the frost on his coat, the sack sagging with its endless weight. His hand extended, patient. I tilted the tin, and barely a trace fell. Grey dust, not enough to coat the bottom. It vanished into the sack like breath into the wind. His hand did not withdraw. He stood there, waiting, the darkness beneath his head shifting, deepening, the faint curve of that smile stretching wider. "I have no more," I whispered, though I don't know why. I hadn't spoken to anyone in days. My own voice sounded strange, brittle in the cold. For a moment, nothing. Then he lifted his hand again, not palm up this time, but pointing past me into the room. I slowly turned, and the hearth was full. Flames burned bright where none had been seconds before. The logs glowed white hot, their shapes already crumbling, and the ashes piling higher, impossibly fast, spilling over the grate. The whole room filled with the smell of smoke, acrid and choking, and when I turned back, the collector's sack was open wide, waiting. I stumbled forward, seized the poker, and scraped furiously, shoveling the ash into my tin until my arms shook. I poured it into the sack, and it swallowed greedily, hungrily. But the fire behind me only burned hotter and faster, consuming more than just wood. I thought I heard the bed crack, the chair splinter, the curtains flare into cinders, though when I turned, nothing was gone, only the fire feeding on something deeper, something I couldn't quite name. Again and again I scraped, poured, scraped and poured, and each time I looked into that sack, it seemed larger, darker, its mouth stretching impossibly. When at last the hearth was bare again, I staggered back, chest heaving. My hands were blackened, my face streaked with soot. The collector only closed the sack with a slow, deliberate pull of the drawstring, and for the first time, he stepped forward into the threshold of my room. I backed away until my shoulder struck the wall. He bent low, the brim of his hat nearly brushing my head, and at last I saw beneath it not a face, not anything human, only a cavity, deep and endless, lined with embers, a mouth that stretched wider and wider the longer I looked, until I felt I might fall into it. This smile was not expression, but shape, the way the earth cracks when fire burns beneath it. His breath washed over me, and with it came a sound, the faintest whisper of countless voices, layered together, begging, breaking, and burning. I don't remember deciding to move. I only remember running. Through the square, through the snow, past the shuttered windows of houses that wouldn't open for me. The hush followed, heavy, pressing, until my ears rang with it. I didn't stop until the trees swallowed me, until the forest closed in. until I saw again the glow ahead, the clearing, and the pit waited. The collector stood at its edge, though I had left him behind. His sack sagged full, heavier than before, as though it carried not ash, but the weight of all things. He loosened the drawstring. The contents poured, a torrent of grey cascading into the hollow. And the pit stirred. The breath rose from below, stronger, hotter, carrying with it sparks that whirled like fireflies, each one a fragment of something once living, as though it carried not ash, but the weight of all things. He loosened the drawstring, and the contents poured, a torrent of grey cascading into the hollow. The pit stirred, carrying with it sparks that whirled like fireflies, each one a fragment of something once living. The ground shuddered, the trees bent, the sky cracked faintly, as though straining against the weight of what lay beneath. I fell to my knees, the heat blistering, the air burning in my lungs. And for a moment, I thought it would all end there, that the earth itself would split, the coiled shape below rising at last. But then I understood. It wasn't ready. It wasn't time. This was not the end of the ritual, but the continuation of it, the feeding, the waiting, the endless patience of something too vast to measure. I crawled backward, clawing at the frozen ground. My hands blistered, my skin split, but I didn't stop until the trees hit the pit again, until the night swallowed me whole. When I stumbled back into the square at dawn, no one spoke to me. No one asked where I had been, but I saw the way they looked at me now, not with suspicion, not with pity, with relief. I had survived what few ever dared. I had seen and returned, but their relief was not for me. It was for themselves, because now they knew I would never leave. And I understood it too. Harriston was no town. It was a sacrifice ground. And I was bound to it, caught in its gravity, until the day the collector came not for ash, but for me. That night, I waited in my room, listening for the knock that would not come. And when the hush fell, I thought I had gone deaf. When I closed my eyes, I heard only the breath of the thing below, slow, patient, and eternal. I knew, with a certainty deeper than fear, that there would come a day when the ashes were not enough. And when that day arrived, I would open the door. I reached the house just before dusk, the fog curling low across the road like smoke. It sat on the edge of the forest, tall, narrow, built of dark stone that gleamed wet in the mist. The windows reflected nothing, just a dull sheen, like blind eyes. When I opened the door, the first thing I noticed wasn't the smell of dust or age. It was the sound. Ticking, soft, layered, from everywhere at once. 1,000 tiny beats overlapping each other. Too many to count, too uneven to form a pattern. It felt like stepping into a living lung, each clock a valve exhaling a breath of time. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, simply listening. Every wall was covered in clocks. Grandfather clocks with polished brass pendulums, cuckoos frozen mid-flight, carriage clocks, pocket watches, even desk timers. Some stood tall as men, others no bigger than a coin. And all of them alive, keeping time in their own voices. I had inherited the house from my grandfather, a man I had barely known. The solicitor had delivered the key with an odd, cautious tone. He left one particular instruction: keep the clock's wound. At the time, I thought it was sentimental nonsense, the rambling of a dying clockmaker. But now, surrounded by the chorus of ticking, it felt more like a command. I set my suitcase down, turned on the hallway lamp, and let my eyes adjust. The place was immaculate, untouched since his death. Even the floors gleamed. And on every table, in every alcove, clocks of every shape and age stood side by side, their faces faintly glowing in the lamplight. It should have been claustrophobic, but it really wasn't. It was mesmerizing, a living museum of time. I spent my evening wandering from room to room, running my fingers over the carvings, inspecting the movements, and listening to how each one ticked a little differently, like 1,000 tiny hearts. In the workshop at the back of the house, I found his bench exactly as he'd left it. Tools arranged by size, dozens of small jars labeled in neat handwriting, springs, screws, gears, and there, in the center of the table, an unfinished clock. It was beautiful or unsettling. I couldn't decide. The casing was carved from black wood, polished to a dull sheen, etched with strange geometric markings. The face was blank, no numbers, and a single brass pendulum hung still, the rest of the mechanism incomplete. I felt drawn to it, as though it were waiting for something, or someone. Beside it lay a leather-bound notebook, my grandfather's handwriting, small and spidery, filled every page. I flipped through until one line caught my eye. Keep the time moving. Never watch the minute. I laughed softly under my breath. You really lost it at the end, didn't you, old man? But the words stayed with me. By the time I finished unpacking, it was close to midnight. The air had turned cold enough that my breath hung in the light from the lamps. I made tea and sat in the living room, the clock chorus wrapping around me like rain. The rhythm was strangely soothing. Then, without warning, everything stopped. The pendulums froze. The ticking ended mid-beat. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Even the sound of the wind outside vanished. For a second, I thought I had gone deaf. The silence was so complete, it had weight. The kind that presses on your eardrums until your own pulse sounds like thunder. I looked at my wristwatch. The second hand had halted perfectly between marks. And yet, I could still move. I waved a hand in front of my face, and the motion looked wrong. Too slow, like moving underwater. I stood up, heart pounding, and stepped toward the mantel clock. The flame from the lamp beside it hung still, frozen in a curve of yellow light. I whispered to myself, "What the hell?" The sound left my mouth but felt dampened, as if the air were thick. Then, just as suddenly, the ticking returned. Every clock in the house burst back to life in unison, a crash of motion that startled a gasp out of me. The pendulum swung again, the flame flickered, and the world exhaled. I stood in the center of the room, laughing nervously, trying to calm my shaking hands. Power surge, I told myself. Or maybe I just zoned out. But deep down, I knew better. The clocks weren't electric, and my tea sitting beside me was still steaming, exactly as it had been before. I checked the time, 12:01, exactly 1 minute gone. I stayed up for hours after that, testing clocks, listening, waiting for it to happen again. But it didn't. The night went on as if nothing had happened. By 3 in the morning, I was too tired to care. I wound a few clocks before bed, out of habit more than belief, and turned out the light. As I lay there, eyes half closed, I could hear the ticking fade into the distance like a lullaby. Then something strange happened. Beneath that ocean of ticks, I heard another sound. Soft, faint, rhythmic. It wasn't a clock. A heartbeat. I sat up, listening. It seemed to come from somewhere deep in the house. Slow, steady, matching the rhythm of my own chest. And just when I started to think I'd imagined it, every clock in the house ticked once, all at the exact same moment. The heartbeat stopped, and the ticking went on. The morning after that first stillness, the house felt different. Not haunted exactly, at least not yet, but attentive. The clocks sounded sharper, each tick more distinct. And when I walked through the rooms, their rhythm followed me, as if they were aware of my movements. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I was listening too closely. I told myself I had grown jumpy. I made coffee, opened the curtains, and let the grey light spill in. The fog outside was thick enough to hide the tree line. The ocean, which I could usually hear faintly beyond the cliffs, was completely silent that day. I spent the morning working. The workshop smelled of old oil and varnish, the way my grandfather had always kept it. I polished gears, replaced the spring, and wound each clock until their ticking synchronized again. The sound was reassuring, methodical. It wasn't until late afternoon that I realized I had been avoiding looking directly at the old walnut clock in the far corner. The one whose casing was cracked, its glass slightly warped. It had been here when I arrived, unmoved, unmentioned in any of my grandfather's records. And every time I turned toward it, the light in the workshop seemed to shift just slightly. Not brighter or darker, just different. Still, I told myself it was just a trick of exhaustion. That evening, as the fog outside thickened again, I decided to try something I hadn't dared before. I needed to see what happened when time stopped. I prepared carefully, the way a scientist prepares an experiment. I checked the oil in the lamps. I placed a small one in the center of the room so I could watch how its flame behaved. I set up my phone on the workbench to record everything, and then I wound every clock in the house, one by one, until the air vibrated with hundreds of overlapping ticks. When I was finally done, I sat in the middle of the workshop and simply listened. Tick, tick, tick. Each sound was small, but together they filled the air like breath in lungs. The walls pulsed faintly with the rhythm. At exactly 11:45, the sound began to drift out of sync. Some clocks raced, others lagged, like a choir losing its conductor. The rhythm tangled and folded back on itself until I couldn't tell where one tick ended and the next began. And then, without warning, the silence fell. It didn't fade in. It arrived, like a curtain dropping over the world. The flame of the lamp froze in mid-flicker. The air suddenly turned dense. heavy enough to press against my skin. I raised a hand and moved it in front of my face, watching the motion unfold cleanly, smoothly, while everything else remained absolutely still. It was the same as before, that one frozen minute, but this time I didn't panic. I stood up. My boots made no sound on the wood, and the ticking was gone. In its place came a faint ringing in my ears, high and thin, like a tone only I could hear. The world looked strange without motion. The dust that hung in the air was suspended mid-fall, tiny silver specks glimmering in the lamplight. The shadows had hardened too, not soft gradients, but sharp edges, like ink lines drawn around objects. I moved to the window. Outside, the fog had congealed into a single solid mass. There was no wind and no sound. Even the faint reflection of my face in the glass didn't move when I did. The longer I stood there, the more my heartbeat seemed to fill the silence. It didn't sound like it was inside me anymore. It echoed through the house, slow and heavy, a sound I felt in the soles of my feet. I turned back to the room. The lamp stood still in the center, flame shaped like a glass teardrop. Around it, the clocks looked half alive, their faces gleaming faintly in the frozen light. I walked among them, studying each one. Some had stopped at different times, 12, 12:01, some even 12:03, though only seconds could have passed since the silence fell. Then my gaze caught on the walnut clock. It stood in the far corner, taller than the others, its casing darker with age. I hadn't wounded earlier. Its keyhole was rusted, its face webbed with tiny cracks. But now its pendulum was swinging, barely perceptible, a slow, hypnotic sway. I stared, certain I was imagining it. Everything else was still, even the flame. But the pendulum of the clock moved, steady as a pulse. I stepped closer to it. The air grew colder, my breath thickened, hanging in front of me. I reached out a hand, intending to touch the glass, to prove it was just vibration, an optical illusion. But before my fingers reached it, a sound vibrated through the stillness. Not a tick, not a chime, something softer, a creak deep within the woods, like an old door slowly opening somewhere far away. Then the pendulum stopped swinging. For a moment, the entire room seemed to inhale. The pressure inside my ears deepened. A hairline crack split the glass of the walnut clock's face, running from the top corner to the center. From behind it, the shadow thickened, a dark smear that moved against the unmoving world. I froze. Something was inside the clock. The shadow shifted again, pressing outward, warping the wood as though the casing itself were breathing. The faint ringing in my head turned into a low hum, almost a vibration. Then the glass cracked again, and a fragment fell soundlessly to the floor. Through the opening, I saw motion, the slow, deliberate uncurling of something that wasn't mechanical, something jointed, smooth. An arm, too long, too thin, unfolding itself from the hollow space where the pendulum had been. The hand was translucent, like glass or wax, and through it I could see faint shapes moving, turning, interlocking, like gears. The thing reached forward, flexing, its surface catching the frozen lamplight and bending it wrong, refracting it into shapes that hurt my eyes. Then the rest of it came through. A torso, a shoulder, a head that wasn't quite shaped like a head, more like a sculpted blur, a suggestion of human form that never settled. The thing stepped out of a clock like a man stepping through a doorway, but the air rippled where it passed, and the frozen dust bent around its outline. I backed away slowly. The world had no sound, but I could feel its movement like static on my skin. It straightened to its full height, nearly scraping the ceiling, and turned toward me. The face, if it had one, caught the light for a fraction of a second, showing hollows where eyes might have been. For a moment, we simply stared at each other. Then, impossibly, the smooth surface of its face twitched. Not an expression, just the faintest tilt, like recognition. Then, time moved again. The silence shattered. The sound of the clocks rushed back in a wave. Every tick, every chime, all at once. The lamp flame jumped violently, and my breath came out in a gasp. When I looked back at the walnut clock, it was whole again. The glass unbroken, the pendulum still, the corner of the room perfectly ordinary. But the frost on the floor near it hadn't been there before. A thin layer, shaped faintly like a footprint, half melted, leading away from the clock and disappearing under the workbench. I stood there until my legs went numb, listening to the clocks resume their endless rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. It was only when I checked my phone later that I realized what had happened. The video had stopped recording at exactly 12, and there was nothing. Not even a single frame for the next 60 seconds. The clocks kept ticking long after the thing disappeared. Too steady, too calm. Their rhythm felt rehearsed, like an apology whispered after a crime already done. I sat on the floor for a long time, staring at the cracked glass of the walnut clock. The fracture was gone again. The face looked smooth, ordinary even. But when I leaned close, I could see faint smudges inside the glass, like fingerprints pressed from within. I didn't move for hours. The lamps burned low. The fog outside turned from grey to black. The house had no night sounds anymore. No creaking, no wind. Just the slow ticking sound. It should have comforted me, like it always had. My grandfather had said once that clocks were the only proof that time was real. That without them, the world would just hang in place, waiting to be noticed. Now, I truly knew what he meant. By morning, I had convinced myself that maybe it was over, that the stillness had been a single, unrepeatable thing, a miracle, a hallucination, something the mind conjures when it spends too long alone, with machines that imitate life. But every time I thought that, I remembered the moment when it had looked at me, that smooth, glassy face turning, not with anger or hunger, but recognition, as if it had finally found what it had been waiting for. That was truly the worst part. This creature knew me now. I tried to keep busy. I rewound every clock, polished the brass until my fingers ached. I even swept the dust from the workshop floor. But it didn't help. The rhythm of the ticks seemed off again, stretched, elastic. Some clocks skipped beats altogether. And at noon, I heard a faint sound upstairs. Something shifting. A single thump. I froze mid-step. The house settled again, pretending innocence. But when I went to check, one of the bedroom clocks had stopped. The hands were fixed at 12. I just turned and left it alone. By evening, I stopped pretending to work. I sat at the table near the lamp, staring at the walls as the light faded. Every sound made me flinch. The ticking, the faint scrape of branches against the window, all of it felt like a countdown. There's a strange kind of peace in inevitability, when you know something is coming and there's nothing you can do. The fear stops burning hot. It cools, solidifies, becomes something heavy you just carry around. That's what I felt as the night deepened. Not panic, just wait. I thought about leaving, of course. The car keys were still in my coat pocket. The road out of the village curved along the cliffs, and I could make it before the fog thickened. If I left now. But I didn't. Something about leaving felt wrong, as though the house wouldn't let me, or worse, that I owed it something. The clocks ticked on, perfectly in time now. Every swing, every click, each second folding neatly into the next. The same way breath folds into breath, until you stop noticing it. At exactly 11:30, I poured myself a drink, the last of the whiskey I'd brought. I sat at the workbench and watched the walnut clock. The fracture was gone, yes, but the glass wasn't clear anymore. It had gone faintly opaque, fogged from within. I knew what that meant. Somewhere deep in the stillness that waited between one tick and the next, it was moving again, preparing. The clock faces glinted faintly as the minutes crawled by. I could feel time stretching thin around me, thinning like ice underfoot. The air seemed to change texture, thicker, slower. I looked at my reflection in the lamp glass. My eyes looked older than they had this morning. Not just tired, aged. 11:55. The ticks grew louder, each one hit like a heartbeat in the dark. 11:58. The air pressed close to my skin. The lamp flame trembled. The house made a long, low sound. The groan of timber under weight. 11:59. The second hand of the mantel clock trembled once and then stopped. The silence wasn't sudden this time. It rolled in slow, like fog across a field, swallowing each sound one by one, until all that was left was my own breath. I didn't stand. I didn't run. There was nowhere to go. I just sat there, watching the walnut clock, the lamp frozen mid-flicker beside it. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the glass began to move. Not crack, breathe. The fog inside the glass thickened and pressed outward, stretching the surface until it shimmered. From behind it, faint shapes stirred, the curve of a shoulder, the outline of a face. I felt the room tilt slightly, as though gravity itself had shifted direction. The air grew heavy enough to press against my chest, and the shadow behind the glass leaned forward. I saw it, the faint glint of gears moving beneath translucent skin. The thing had shape now. It had purpose, and it was coming through. My breath didn't quicken, my heart didn't race. There was simply no point. I understood now what my grandfather had built. Not clocks, not instruments, barriers, machines that kept the stillness at bay. And one of them had failed. The pendulums began to slow again, one by one. The silence deepened until it was a weight on my shoulders. And then I heard it. Not the ticking, not the heartbeat. Something softer. A whisper. It came from inside the walnut clock, low and steady, spoken in my own voice. Keep the time moving. The light dimmed. The flame of the lamp froze. The glass of the clock rippled outwards, once, twice, like water disturbed by breath. I leaned closer to it without meaning to, the way a moth leans toward heat. And the last thought that crossed my mind was absurdly calm. Maybe it would all stop once it began. Then the glass broke like ice, and everything went still.